Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Lesson 5 of Lambda School's free mini bootcamp we're offering. This is Lesson 5 out of 12. So last week we started the bootcamp, and we covered the fundamentals of Git and version control. We started looking at HTML and basic CSS. We dove into CSS a little bit deeper and learned a bit about positioning and using the display and position elements or properties of CSS, as well as introduction to Flexbox. Then on Friday or on Thursday, we started working on JavaScript and kind of had a basic introduction to JavaScript, talked about variables, basic primitive data types, strings, numbers, booleans, talked about functions and the role they play and the syntax that they need. And then we also started talking about control flow and comparison operators. So that was all last week. If you're just joining us for the first time tonight, welcome. And there are links on our GitHub page to the previous 4 lessons, the videos that have all that material, pre-recorded videos, which is just a recorded video of this lesson, is on that GitHub document. And so feel free, if you're just joining us, to hang out tonight, go over the lesson we're going to talk about tonight, and then go dive into those previous lessons. And that has a lot of the material you'll need to complete the bootcamp work. Once again, if you are planning on joining Lambda School or applying for the full-time program, this is all this work is a prerequisite to starting the program, and we actually give priority to those of you that have gone through and completed the mini bootcamp work. And so be sure to mention that you have done that when you apply. And then you'll get a little bit of extra priority. And then, as soon as we see that you've put in the effort and you've taken the time to complete these assignments, and then you'll get a little bit more priority in the application process. This is, we are offering this mini bootcamp free of charge. It's 12 lessons. So it runs 3 weeks. This is our second week, and next week will be our last week. Yeah, so welcome to those of you who are coming back from last week. Welcome back, and those of you that are new, welcome to the program in general. Let's get started today. I'm going to share my screen, and I will talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. Great. So today we're going to keep going into JavaScript. We'll actually stay in JavaScript land here for the next. Today's lesson 5, so the next 5 lessons will be all in JavaScript. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about control flow, and we talked about if statements last week. We're going to start talking about else ifs and elses this week, or this lesson. A little bit more about comparison operators, a little bit kind of more of an explanation of the fundamentals of comparison operators. And we're going to talk about for loops. And so we're going to start talking about looping and what that means in software development and JavaScript in particular. We'll talk about logical operators, and then we're going to talk about the arguments object inside of every function. Before we get started with all of that, though, kind of wanted to go over a couple of kind of things that don't really fit into any specific type or place in learning JavaScript. And that's 2 types that we're going to see quite often, one more than the other, and that's undefined, undefined and null. So essentially, you'll see these, you may hear about them talked about kind of interchangeably. They essentially have 2 different meanings, and they have 2 different places you'll see them used. Let's talk about undefined first. So undefined is always the computer, the JavaScript transpiler, telling you that what you're looking for doesn't exist. So let's say we have, let's say we console log a variable and we call it name, right? So we can see on the screen here that there is no such variable as name. And whenever there's a block of text without quotes around it, it's either a variable or a keyword or a global object in JavaScript. Name is not a keyword or a global object in JavaScript, so it has to be a variable. So JavaScript is going to look for the variable of name. When it doesn't find it, in Replit here, it's going to just tell us, give us an error. In other places, it might just give us undefined, but we'll see. Oh yeah, there we go. We just got undefined. So what that's saying is that's the computer telling us that what we're asking it for doesn't exist. Undefined is almost always going to be a product of the computer itself. You can create variables that equal undefined, but essentially you're doing the same exact thing as not creating a variable. So if we said const name equals undefined, essentially it's just not creating a name variable. We'll see. And it just says undefined. So undefined is, as a rule of thumb, is always going to be the computer itself telling you that what you are looking for doesn't exist. Right? And so when we start talking about arrays and objects and things like that, we're going to start to see undefined a lot. And we can definitely use that to our benefit. The other one I was going to talk about is something called null. And null is always going to be returned when a developer, either yourself, someone on your team, code that you're working with that you didn't write, it's always a human being, a developer telling you that what you're asking for exists, but it has no value. Null does not equal 0. Null does not equal false. Null equals null. It represents no value. So if I wanted to say, we'll just say, once again, we're going to have our const name. Go first name. I don't know why it's giving us that error. We can go first name. So in this case, in the case of null, null is always going to have to be set by a developer. So it's when the developer wants to tell you that first name, that variable exists, but it currently does not have a value. And we'll see it just comes back null as when we console log it, it's null. Let's just remove that so we don't get that undefined and make things a little more clear. We just get null back when we call that variable. It means that exists, but it has no value. If that variable did not exist, we would get, well, first name is not defined. We would essentially get undefined. Okay, so there's two big differences between the two. Undefined, as a rule of thumb, is always going to be the computer telling you that what you're looking for doesn't exist. Null is going to be a human being telling you that what you're looking for exists, but it currently has no value. Okay, so there's a couple of interesting things to keep in mind when we start talking about, start calling variables, and especially when we start talking about objects. It's really important. One other thing I wanted to talk about that doesn't really fit into anywhere, but kind of does into this lesson today, especially since we learned about if statements last week, is the concept of truthiness. So truthiness is something that lies in every single item, every single data type in JavaScript. We talk about Boolean values, right? Remember, we have true and false. And true and false are Boolean values, and we know that those are the only two Boolean values, right? Boolean means one or the other, 0 or 1, on or off, true or false. And in the JavaScript world, it means true or false. So when we have something like an if statement that is asking us for a true or false statement, remember, as a kind of a refresher to our lesson last week, the if statement inside of these parentheses is looking for this to either equal true or false. That's all it cares about. It doesn't care about what's in there. It just has to be true or false. If we said 1 + 1 triple equals, remember, and we'll go over this again, why the triple equals is there. 1 plus 1 triple equals 2. This is going to return true. So it's going to say if this statement is true, then let's console log true. And when we run this, we see it console logs true out there. Okay, and we can also say if 1 plus 1 equals 3, and as a refresher from last week, this is going to return false. So nothing in here will run. Well, JavaScript, in its attempt to be very helpful to us, assigns what we call a truthiness to every single value, every single data type in JavaScript. And this is not something that you need to implement at the moment, but it's not something that you need to understand, because when you do something, when you're writing an if statement that says, if we have const number equals, well, we won't do const, we'll do let, since const can't be changed. Let number equals 2, we're going to see, if we do this, number equals 3, this is going to come back true. And so this is going to run, even though we were asking for that. To make it a little bit more clear, every single item, every single data type in JavaScript has a truthiness to it. So the number 1 is considered true. And in fact, any number other than 0 is considered true. 0 is the only number that is considered false. So -1 is still considered true. Any string that has anything in it, my name, for example, will return true. A string with nothing in it, which we call this an empty string, there's not even a space. If there's a space in there, there's still a character in that string. If there is nothing in that string, that's false. Okay, so it's kind of going to be a learning experience of determining whether the data type you're using is true or false, and why you might get some unexpected results. 2 of the data types we just talked about today, undefined and null, are conveniently both false. So we see undefined is false, and null is false as well. So this, like I said, this is not something that you should implement. This is not something that you should use at the moment. In the future, once you have a much better grasp of the JavaScript language, you can start playing around with these kind of, we call this type coercion. But at the moment, I pointed out just so that you have the understanding of my if statement is not working the way I thought it was going to work. Well, go and look at what you're asking your if statement for. And if it's something that is returning a value instead of not a Boolean value, but any other data type, you may be getting a different result than you're looking for. Not meant to confuse you by any means, just meant to point it out so that you have, you can start looking at your code and start debugging it a little on your own when it's not working the way you want it to work. So beyond that, let's move back and into comparison operators. We talked a little bit about it yesterday or on Thursday about comparison operators. And comparison operators are greater than equal, less than equal, triple equals, and what we say not equal to. And so they work just like they would in a math class, with the exception of these last 2. We'll just talk about the first 4. And so let's do go with that little comment. Anytime you see, as a side note, these 2 forward slashes, that means that's a comment, and that line will not be read by the computer. So you can write, any comment you want in your code, like comparison operators. And then we can give a little what they are, and then we can talk about them. So comparison operators work just like they would in math class. Let's say 10 is greater than 9. And comparison operators are always going to return a Boolean value. They're always going to return a true or a false. So if I said 10 is greater than 9, you'll see that it returns true on my screen here. If I said 10 is greater than 10, that's false, because 10 is equal to 10. We can also talk about greater than or equal to. So 10 is greater than or equal to 10 because it is 10. And because they're equal to each other. So just note that greater than equal to, or less than equal to, greater than equal to, are going to always return a Boolean value, either true or false. Those are pretty standard. Let's get into some non-standard comparison operators, the triple equals. So triple equals, as we saw, as I told you on Thursday, when we assign a variable, we see that we use a single equal sign. Oh, we're going to say that first name because it's having a problem with name for some reason. So we assign our variable, and we use a single equal sign. And if you remember on Thursday, I had mentioned that equals is always an assignment. That's always assigning a value to a variable or to a property or to something. A single equal sign is always an assignment. If you want to compare two items, if I want to say first name is equal to Dan, if I want to know if those two items are the same, then I need to use an equality operator, right? So this is our comparison. And we use triple equals. There is a such thing as double equals. I do want to bring it up because it does exist, and if you're going around the internet and looking at other code examples, you might see double equals. JavaScript, in its ability to help us out, will do something we call type coercion. And so what that's saying is double equals is going to look at two different items and two different types, and it's going to coerce one of the items. It tries to be very helpful to us and say, oh, they're asking if the number 1 is equal to the string with the character 1 in it. Well, they asked for a double equals, so we're going to assume that they meant both the same things, and we'll see that it returns true. Triple equals does a much more complex equality, and it says if they are not exactly the same item, then that they're not true. So 1 is equal to the string of 1. So for that reason, we want to be very explicit in our equality, especially as we're learning JavaScript, because the double equals can introduce some side effects. And so that we're not expecting. So especially when we're learning, and even through the full Lambda course, and even into your professional career, I personally always use triple equals, and there's a very valid reason to use double equals, because that just keeps it from a lot of bugs slipping into your code. So triple equals, remember, will not only compare the two items, but compare their type as well. So, just once again, the string of 1, triple equals 1 is false. And we would expect that too, because it's a string and a number, right? So just keep that in mind. That's why we use triple equals. The last comparison operator we're going to talk about is the not equal to. Just like triple equals, this is our triple equal version of not equal to. And there is also a double equal version. For the sake of this course and for our learning environment, we are always going to use the not equal to with 3 characters here. And so not equal to is going to be the opposite of equal to. Not equal to is going to say, are these not equal to each other? And we'll see that right now 1 is not equal to 1 is false, because they are equal to each other. 1 not equal to 2, that's true. This character right here, the exclamation mark or the bang as some developers call it, is called the not operator in JavaScript. And we're going to revisit the not operator in a little bit. But just remember that that means, are those two items not equal to each other? So we had talked about if statements and control flow last week. So let's go back to that. And, if statements and control flow and comparison operators, they lend a lot to each other, because comparison operators are going to compare two items and return a Boolean statement, and ifs are asking for a Boolean statement. So let's write a basic if statement. Remember, we use the keyword if, we use an open and closing parentheses, and we use an open and closing brace. If the statement that we give, the if statement in here, if what's in between those parentheses returns true, then this code inside of these braces will run. If what's in there returns false, then this code will not be run. So let's just go through this again. Console.log. This is true. Okay. And so we have true. Right? So it's going to console log this is true. If we have false, then it should false. And it should console log nothing. That code is not run. Okay. So in our if statement, we can also start using comparison operators. So 1 is equal to 1. Is this going to return true? Is 1 triple equal to, is the number 1 triple equal to the number 1? That's true. Is it not equal to the number 1? That's false, so that won't run. And we can start to use, we can see how, let's go const 1 equals 1. Now we can use a variable in here. Is the variable 1, well, let's call this number, because 1 or num. 1 is a little too, we know what number it is. So we say if num is equal to 1, console log this is true. And we'll see that num is equal to 1. And now that number 1 is triple equal to the number 1. That's true. So now that's going to run. So there's a chance that this variable could have, different context, different value to it every time our program is run. And so let's say that's age. And let's create an age 14. And now let's create a function that takes the age and runs a little if statement for us. And we're going to call this, can I drive? Okay, remember from last week, our function syntax is the function keyword, the name of the function. We have parentheses with optional arguments inside of it. We're going to give it one argument, which is the value of age. Let's say user age to make it a little less confusing. And now we're going to say if the user age is equal to 16, we'll say, or well, we'll just say equals to right now. Like, yes, you can drive. And let's return this. So let's go, can I drive? And we'll give it our age, which is 14. And we'll see that nothing happens because the user age is not 16. So what if we want to compare, or let's make that 16, and now it says, yes, you can drive. What if we want to compare it against multiple ages and give it different readouts for different ages? Well, we can use an else if statement. So what this is going to do, age is less than 16. What this is going to do is this is all part of the if statement now. And let me kind of separate that so you can see. So the if statement is going to ask if the user age is equal to 16. If that returns true, then this block of code will run, right? If that returns false, this block of code will not run. And then it will go down to this block of code. And it's going to say else if user age is less than 16, console log, not yet. Now we can see that if the age is 14, which we put that age in here, that is equal to user age inside of the function. User age, so that's going to say 14 triple equals 16. That's false, so this does not get run. Else if 14 is less than 16. That's true, so this block of code does get run. Okay, so we can have this for all kinds of things. So let's go, age is greater than 16. Yes, you can drive. Let's say else if user age equals 16. We'll say console log happy birthday. Even though it might not be their birthday, we're just going to say it is. Okay, console log. And now else if. Okay, so we're going to have 3 checks here, all for the same user age. We're going to say if the user age is greater than 16, it's yes, you can drive. Else if the user age is equal to 16, we're going to tell them happy birthday because we just figured it's their birthday. Otherwise, else if user age is less than 16, we're going to say not yet. So now we can see not yet for 14. 16 is going to give us happy birthday. And 17 is going to give us yes, you can drive. So 17 is greater than 16, so this code will run. And just know that when a block of code runs in an if statement, nothing else after it will run. Only one of these will run, okay? Only one of them. Even if this is true and this is true, only the first one will run. Okay, so that leads us to our last bit of control flow, and that is our else statement. And our else is just our default. So this is saying we have some checks that we want to make. If none of those checks are true, we still want to do something. Okay, and in this case, we can see if user age is greater than 16, console log, yes, you can drive. If user age is equal to 16, console log, happy birthday. Else, what if it's, okay, so let's think about it. What if the age is not greater than 16 and not equal to 16? It has to be less than 16. So then we're just going to say else, not yet. So I always say our else statement is our backup plan. It's if we want to do something, but it doesn't meet any of the criteria where we have an exact specification of what we want it to run. It's our backup plan. We want to make sure that we check to see if they're over 16 and if they're equal to 16. Otherwise, let's have a backup plan and just say not yet. So we can say, yes, you can drive. And then we'll go 11, not yet. So our if statement runs and it says false. User age is not equal to 16. So it skips this code. It then goes on to the else if user age is equal to 16. 11 triple equals 16, that is also false. So that one will skip. And then it gets to this else statement. It says, well, if I got here, then nothing else is true. So I'll run this code. So that is how our if, else if, and else statements run. This is called our control flow. And so sometimes I get asked, why wouldn't you just do, 3 if statements instead of writing if, else if? Let's go user age less than 16. Why wouldn't I just use 3 if statements? So let's go with, let me try to give an example real quick. The user age, probably not a great example, but let's just see. If user age is greater than or equal to 16. Okay, yep. So for some reason we have, we want to only run one of these blocks of code. But if we have something like 16 in there or 17 in there, it's going to say if user age is greater than 16, that's true. So run this code. This is a separate if statement. So in our else if, the rest of it would be skipped. But if we have separate if statements, this one will also be run, and this one will also print out. And we'll see that both of them print out. But when in actuality, we only wanted it to act on one of them. And that's where if, and else's come in, is if we want our code only to act on one of these statements, we would write this. And write this as an entire if statement block. And so that's why we use else if, because only one of these will get run. Let's move on to logical operators. So I'm going to delete our can I drive, and I just want to talk about logical operators for just a moment. The logical operators are a lot like comparison operators, except that they are going to compare two Booleans, two equality statements. Whereas a comparison operator says, is 10 greater than 16? Let's say this is true. If it's true, then we'll console log true. 10 greater than 16, false. Okay, is 17 greater than 16? That is true, so that console log is true for us. Logical operators take it one step further. It's if we want to know if two statements are true. And so there's three logical operators we talk about. First, there's the AND statement, which is signified by two ampersands. So shift 7. And it has to be two of them. The OR statement, which is two vertical lines on the Mac. It's right above your return enter key. On Windows, I'm not 100% sure. But it's two vertical lines, and the NOT statement. Okay, we had seen that earlier. We're going to talk about it again a little right now. So the AND statement takes a statement like 17 is greater than 16 and 18 is greater than 20. So these are both, with an AND statement, both sides of this have to be true. So we'll see that is 17 greater than 16? That's true. Okay, is 18 greater than 20? That's false. If both sides of this are not true, then this whole statement is false. And we can see that. So let me just make it a little bit more clear. We can just write true and true. And we can see that it does. This statement is true. Okay, so true and true. If we do true and false, we'll see that, let's go else. Log, this statement is false. Okay, so both sides of an AND have to be true. And we can do that with whatever we want. 10 triple equals 10, and false and true. Okay, so 10 equals 10, so that's true, and true is obviously true, so that's going to be true. And we say 1 less than 10. Both of those are true, so the AND statement is true. Now, to kind of counter that is the OR statement. So AND we can think of as both that side and both the left and the right side are true. Both are true. The OR is either the left or the right is true. So if one of these is false, that's fine. Only one of them has to be true. Okay, we can see this statement is true when we use the OR, because one of them is true. If both of them are false, then it will be false. Okay, so that's the AND the OR operators. It takes some playing around with, but just know that it's going to evaluate both sides. The and is going to ask if they're both true. The or is going to ask if one of them is true. So the last logical operator is the not operator. And the not operator is a little bit more confusing than the and the or. So it takes something like true, and you put the not operator in front of it, and it's going to flip the truthiness of that item to whatever the other side is. So this is going to be false. And we can see this statement is false. That is not. So it's the opposite. The opposite of false is true. So now we see this statement is true. If we say the opposite of 10 equals 10, and just to point out here, we can use parentheses to wrap statements, and you will find them useful in the future to wrap an entire statement like this. So this is going to return true, and then the not is going to flip that, and it's going to say this statement is false. And so we can, mix and match as we please. Let's go not and true. So in this case, it looks a little confusing right here, and it definitely is, especially to the beginner eye, is that this is going to run, and it's going to say 10 is greater than 10. That's false. This guy is going to make that true. So this whole thing is going to be true, and the other side is true. So that whole statement is going to be true. This is a little tough to follow at the moment. Just wanted to show you that you can mix and match all of these statements to create one big statement from it. And that's what you will be doing in the future. But for the moment, just know that we're only going to, just know the difference between an and an or, essentially, and then know that the not operator flips whatever the Boolean is. And the not operator can get a little confusing, as we just saw. One thing to keep in mind is if this statement is read left to right, okay? So the statement on the left is evaluated first, and the statement on the right is evaluated second. So if I had something like this, it's going to say true, or, and then it's going to see this or and see that the statement on the left is already true. So it's not even going to look at what's on the right. And this whole thing is going to return true. Okay, and the same goes for and. And requires one of these to be false in order to be false. So if the first side is false, it's not even going to look at the second side. And so just keep that in mind. At the moment, you're not going to need that information. But in the future, we do some kind of tricky things with if and statements or statements that assign things. And so just know that if the first one that he reads, that assign or that logical operator reads, fulfills a part of that operator, like both sides have to be true. So if one side is false, then they're both false, according to the and operator. So just keep that in mind. The next thing we're going to talk about is a loop and for loops. So all software essentially runs on loops. Software is going to, essentially just do something until it either finds what it wants or it gets to the end, and then it's going to stop. And so a loop is just a really great way of doing a repetitive task over and over again until it reaches an end. And the most basic type of loop in JavaScript is called a for loop. And for loops have kind of the same syntax that if statements and functions do. You're going to have the keyword for, you're going to have a parentheses, and you're going to have an open and closing brackets. Now, it's quite different than the function and if statements of what goes in these parentheses. What goes in the parentheses is the most important part. there's 3 items that go in the parentheses of a for loop. First is going to be a variable. So we're going to say let, and we always use I as typically convention, and we'll find out tomorrow why I is convention, but we usually use I. And so we declare a new variable. We end it with a semicolon. Okay, so you always want to declare a variable, and this is called it would be our starting point, where we're going to start out. The second is a statement that is asking for an equality. So this is going to be one of our conditional statements. We'll say if I is less than or equal to 10. Right, so that's all that is. It's just an equality statement, something that's going to return true or false. And then the next thing is going to be what happens every time it loops. So let's go. I equals I plus 1. So now that we have a loop, we have a starting point, we have an equality statement, and we have something to happen every time the loop is run. So let's go and console log I. What we're going to see here that happens is this is going to get evaluated. So I is going to be equal to 0. And then it's going to look at this and it's going to say, is 0 less than or equal to 10? If that's true, then it skips that part for a moment. It runs what's in there. Once it's done running what's in the braces, what's in the braces, then it's going to run this. And then what that's going to do is it's going to reassign I to +1. So that's just going to add 1 to I. We have a shorthand way of doing that, and that's just I plus plus. So that just says take whatever number it is and reassign it +1. So remember, it's going to initialize that variable at 0. It's going to then check this statement for truth. If that's true, it's going to run what's in the braces. And after it's finished running what's in the braces, it's going to perform that operation, check the truth. If it's true, it'll keep doing that until that equals false. So we'll see we have 0 through 10 console logged on the side of our screen. So this is a basic for loop. And it takes a lot of practice to get each of these down, to remember what each of these does. You're going to always remember that there's 3 items in there, but you're going to kind of, you'll need to check your resources and check the documentation for a while. But just to kind of give you an introduction to a for loop. We're going to go a little bit more into for loops tomorrow when we start talking about arrays, because they really lend themselves well to arrays. But just know that this can do anything in here. This can print my name 10 times or 11 times if we wanted it to. And we'll see, there it is. It does whatever's in there. It doesn't always have to be the I. One thing we'll talk about right now, probably go a little more in depth tomorrow, is the infinite loop. And so that is, you always have to make sure that there's a way to exit your loop. If there's not, your loop will, in theory, run forever. And in practice, will probably crash your browser, crash your node server, crash whatever it is running it, because it's going to continue on forever. And so I'll show you in this example. Let's go greater than, let's go less than 0. That's what it was. So if I set my first variable up to be 0, and then I say run this, oops, no, that's what it is. It's greater than 0. Run this while I is greater than or equal to 0. So our variable is 0. If I is greater than or equal to 0, run this. Afterwards, I plus plus. So you can see what happens here. The first time it runs, it's going to be 0. I is greater than or equal to 0. That's true. Second time, it's going to be 1. 1 greater than or equal to 0. True. 2 greater than or equal to 0. 3, 4, 5, forever. And so there's never going to be a time when I is not greater than or equal to 0. And thankfully, Replit has our backs. Let's see. Gotta make sure it's set, or else it's gonna. There we go. Replit has our backs, and that's going to protect us from infinite loops, but this is not always the case, and it will crash your browser if you do it accidentally. So here we get potential infinite loop. So Replit has our backs in that, but if I ran that directly into my browser, that would crash the browser, and I'd have to restart my browser back up again. So keep that in mind. The last item we're going to talk about tonight is something called the arguments object, and that's within our function. Let's go add some numbers. Adds numbers, and every single function, we can declare arguments in here and we can give them names, but even if we don't, every single function inside of it has reference to something called arguments. And arguments is just an array of all of the arguments. And we'll talk about arrays more tomorrow, and we'll talk about arguments a little bit more tomorrow, but I just want to point it out for you tonight. So it gives us the value of all of the arguments inside the function, no matter if they're given names or not. And this is a little confusing at first, and like I said, we'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow night. But what we'll see here is that we've given it 2 arguments, 1 and 2, and even though we didn't give it a name, it's still going to keep reference to that 1 and that 2. And we'll see that we have 1 and 2 over here. And this kind of introduces a couple of really new concepts, arrays, and objects, which we're going to get into in the next couple of days. But just wanted to point that out, that if you want to get, you can have as many as you want in there. And you'll still get reference to all of those items passed in. But definitely talk about that more tomorrow. And for right now, let's open up the next 10 minutes to questions. If you are on Slack, please hop on the hashtag or the questions channel and ask your questions in there. That's where we'll monitor questions during the class. If you have questions about specific problems, either put them in the help channel or into the specific lesson that you're working on. So like, for example, today is lesson 5. So if you have problems from tonight's assignment, put them in the lesson 5 channel and we can talk about it and help you in there. So let's get to some questions. If you have any, please post them in the questions channel. I had one question about something being not greater than or equal to, or not greater than. The not symbol is only really going to work on the equality or converting an already a true or a false. So we can go 5 greater than 4. So if we want to say if 5 is not greater than 4, then that's going to be false, right? So there is no not greater than or not less than. There's only a not equals or just of the opposite. Code reviews. There was a question about code reviews being in the full-time course. All of the code the students write. We have challenges. We have assignments, and there's one-on-one support for all the students with TAs and with the instructors, and we go over code reviews with all the code the students write. So yes, there are. Okay, well, if you guys don't have any more questions, we're going to wrap it up for tonight. Thanks for joining us for lesson 5. There is a lot of information in tonight's lesson. And, you know, a lot of this learning JavaScript is really writing it and practicing it. Like I talked about with for loops, there is definitely, it's take some time to get that syntax down and to understand it. And so work on the assignment if you're just starting. You can start working on the HTML and CSS. If you are just starting, I would highly recommend you start on the assignment from last week, the JavaScript 1 assignment, and then move on to tonight's. If you have finished JavaScript 1, please, by all means, move on to tonight's. If you haven't, we're still here to offer some support. Put your questions in the Lesson 4 channel, and we'll get to you. Otherwise, start on tonight's assignment, which is Lesson 5, JavaScript 2. Also, I'm going to post in the general the how to run tonight's test. Run test. So there, if you forked your repo last week when we started the class, the instructions to run the tests are off. And so I'm just going to post what to copy paste into your terminal. And that'll get you to run tonight's test, which is JavaScript 2. Other than that, thanks a lot for joining us tonight. We'll see you tomorrow night when we go a little bit further into JavaScript and start talking about arrays. Have a good night, everybody.